Everyone, in this video what we're going to do is we're going to look at ethical codes of conduct for engineers. And so we're going to finally see the juxtaposition of the stuff that we did with ethics with some aspects from engineering. So before we get to the content of the code of ethics for engineers, let's talk about the very notion of a code of conduct to begin with. A code of conduct is a kind of creed or confession. Creeds and confessions actually have their origins in religious traditions, especially Christianity. Early on, the Christians would get together and say, here's what we believe. And so you have the Athanasian Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and so on. There's creeds in other religions too. For example, there's the Shema in Judaism or the Shahada in Islam. Later, when Protestant divisions develop, various churches have their own confessions of faith. And what the practitioners do in these creeds and confessions is they get together and say, here's what we believe. In Latin, credo, I believe. And so it's a statement that says, here's what we believe. It might have some declarations about here's what we don't believe. And so codes of conduct actually come out of that tradition of saying, here's what we believe and here's what we do affirm. Before we get to the modern code of conduct for engineers, which comes from 2007, let's actually take a look at the Engineers' Creed from 1954. Now, while there are earlier codes of conduct that go back to immediately after World War II, what we have here in the Engineers' Creed of June 1954 is a succinct statement of the pledge of an engineer. And so let's take a look at the text here. This is from the National Society of Professional Engineers. As a professional engineer, I dedicate my professional knowledge and skill to the advancement and betterment of human welfare. Now, that's the preamble to the pledge. Notice that the entire profession, the duty thereof, is predicated upon the betterment of others, not just some particular group of others, but humanity in general. Not one's own nation, not one's own society, not one's own culture, but the totality of humanity. That's in the preamble of the pledge. Then there's the actual content of the pledge itself. To give the utmost of performance. That giving the utmost of performance, arete, that's entirely the notion of excellence. That's virtue ethics. Secondly, to participate in none but honest enterprise. You're not going to get into shady business. You're going to do everything honestly. That's, again, the esteeming of a virtue. This is virtue ethics. Thirdly, to live and work according to the laws of man and the highest standards of professional conduct. Again, virtue ethics, maybe a little bit of deontology there in the sense of duty to a universal kingdom of ends. Sounds like the third formulation of the categorical imperative. Fourthly, to place service before profit, the honor and standing of the profession before personal advantage, and the public welfare above all other considerations. Again, aspects of deontology, this notion of duty to human welfare, aspects of virtue ethics, certainly, service before profit. There's the sense in which the dignity of the profession itself is a virtue to maintain. And notice the public welfare above all other considerations. There's both a duty there and a sense of what's best for the public that's most valuable, so there's maybe even a hint of utilitarianism in there as well. Finally, there's a section of the pledge which invokes the divine. It says, in humility and with need for divine guidance, I make this pledge. Now, it's not particularly specific there as to how the divine is being invoked, but there is a bit of an invocation there, so there's just a hint of perhaps a little bit of divine command. Let's switch now to looking at the actual 2007 Code of Conduct for Engineers. So here's the 2007 Code of Ethics for Engineers. It can be found as an appendix in your textbook, and it's also easily found online as well. And this is published by the National Society of Professional Engineers. Let's start with the preamble here. Engineering is an important and learned profession. As members of this profession, engineers are expected to exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. Engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. Accordingly, the services provided by engineers require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, but must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. Let's break that down a bit. Let's start with the first sentence. Engineering is an important and learned profession. Notice here, it doesn't start with really a statement of ethics, but a statement of fact about the profession of engineering. It's important and learned. There's an inherent dignity to the profession. Really an inherent virtue therein. And practitioners of this profession, namely engineers, are to, from the get-go, prima facie, exhibit the highest standards of honesty and integrity. They have a duty and an obligation to exhibit virtue. And notice the virtues that it mentions. It does not start here by saying engineers need to be the best builders. Honesty and integrity are the first virtues mentioned here. Honesty has to do with truth-telling. Integrity has to do with consistency in truth-telling. But it follows those two virtues with engineering has a direct and vital impact on the quality of life for all people. The effects of what engineers do affect everyone, directly or indirectly. And therefore it says, accordingly, as such, the services provided by engineers require honesty. Notice now, this is not a long paragraph, and we've already talked about honesty twice. Impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Break that part down a little bit. We've already talked about honesty, but then there's this trifecta of impartiality, fairness, and equity. So we've got impartiality, not favoring one group over another. We've got the notion of fairness, which is that in our dealings with others, we'd treat people with that same impartiality and honesty. And then we've got the notion of equity, which is when we have issues that need to be made up for, we're able to rectify those kinds of inequalities and injustices that may exist out there. But all this is subservient to the notion of dedication to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. Not to various construction projects, not to various kinds of ingenuity, but to the health, safety, and welfare of the public at large. Again, another threefold description. We've got the notion of health, generally speaking, safety, which is usually what we think of when we're talking about engineering ethics, and then welfare, people's well-being at large. And then finally, we have this last statement, engineers must perform under a standard of professional behavior. So here it's relegating to not just the construction of objects, but even in dealings within the profession that requires adherence to the highest principles of ethical conduct. Notice it didn't say conformity to the highest principles of ethical conduct, but adherence. One must affirm these views. So then we see this code of conduct divided into three parts: the fundamental canons, the rules of practice, and the professional obligations. The first part is very short, and really the second and third parts are explications of the first part. Let's take a look a little bit at the first part. So, fundamental canons. Engineers, in the fulfillment of their professional duties, shall, number one, hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. We saw that already in the preamble, but notice that's canon number one. The most important, and notice it defined it as a duty here, is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. 2. Perform services only in areas of their competence. To perform a task outside of your area of competence would literally be incompetence. So in the domain of engineering, if you're a civil engineer and you're asked to do something outside of that domain, say something in computer engineering, where you have a knack for it, but it's not your area of competency, that might be a kind of irresponsibility. You go, oh yeah, I know something about this. 3. Issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. If you're going to be an engineer, your commentary, remember, if your highest service is to the public, then what you say to the public has a special kind of responsibility, which is a term we'll talk about too this semester. You can only talk in an objective and truthful manner. 4. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. So once you're hired on for a task, you are bound by obligation, by duty, to that task insofar as it's in accordance with the principles that we've already established. 5. Avoid deceptive acts. That was quite short, 3 words. But notice it didn't say don't lie. It said avoid deceptive acts. Not just saying things that are untrue, but doing things that are disingenuous and deceptive. 6. Conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully. So here we have a quadrivium, 4 things that need to be done. Conduct oneself honorably, virtue, responsibly, virtue, duty, ethically, in accordance with these principles, and lawfully, not to breach the law. And then it gives a reason. The sentence is not done. It says, so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. One is to act honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as not to besmirch the profession of engineering itself because of that inherent dignity that it already said in the first sentence of the preamble. To act in a way which is dishonorable, disreputable, irresponsible, and unlawfully is to dishonor the profession and to denigrate it, and perhaps even cause its utility to be destroyed. Then if we move down into section 2, you'll notice section 2, rules of practice, are just explications of the 6 canons that have already been established. So, for example, Section 2, subsection 1 is a more fully orbed view of the first canon. So you'll notice here there's if the first canon was to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, well, Section 2, subsection 1, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and then goes into more detail as to what that looks like. So it zooms in on each one of these elements. And so let's take a look at the first one, for example. That first subsection in rules of practice. If engineer's judgment is overruled under circumstances that endanger life or property, they shall notify their employer or client and such other authority as may be appropriate. So what does that mean? If there's an instance where an engineer has said we're going to do this, and then it turns out to be the case that such an endeavor would endanger life or property, they've got to tell their client, hey, we've got it. This is going on. There has to be a transparency there. It might be uncomfortable. This might mean we're going to get fired from the job, but that is one's responsibility, one's duty there. Notice also subsection E. Engineers shall not aid or abet the unlawful practice of engineering by a person or firm. If someone's doing something unethical, we're not going to be a part of it. Notice also there's subscription here to this code at large in subsection F. Engineers having knowledge of any alleged violation of this code shall report thereon to appropriate professional bodies and, when relevant, also to public authorities, and cooperate with proper authorities in furnishing such information or assistance as may be required. There's an obligation in-house to let the engineering authorities know, and then also an obligation to perhaps let public authorities know, whether that be governmental institutions or perhaps even law enforcement. So now let's take a little bit of a look at subsection 2. What does it look like when it says engineers shall perform services only in their areas of competence? Subsection A. Engineers shall undertake assignments only when qualified by education or experience in the specific technical fields involved. Don't go outside of what you know. That would be irresponsible and incompetent. And not just to perform a task. Notice it says here in subsection B, engineers shall not affix their signature to any plans or documents dealing with subject matter in which they lack competence, nor to any plan or document not prepared under their direction and control. Don't sign on to something that you don't know anything about, even if it's just your signature and you're not actually performing anything on the task. Don't just go, oh yeah, I approve of that thing I don't know anything about. Don't do that. The third canon, engineers shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Let's look at subsection A. Engineers shall be objective and truthful in professional reports, statements, or testimony. They shall include all relevant and pertinent information in such reports, statements, or testimony which should bear the date indicating when it was current. Let's take a look at Section 2, subsection 3. Engineers shall be objective and truthful in professional reports, statement, or testimony. They're to be truthful in the things that they do in accordance with their position. They're to be truthful in the things that they do for their job. They can express public technical opinions where they have the knowledge and competence to that effect. And notice this last one. Engineers shall issue no statements, criticism, or arguments on technical matters that are inspired or paid for by interested parties, unless they have prefaced their comments by explicitly identifying the interested parties on whose behalf they are speaking. So, in other words, there can't be a conflict of interest if you're being paid by a certain party to make certain kinds of statements. This happens a lot when it's engineers working for oil companies and there's some kind of oil spill going on. Oh, I'm here on behalf of BP or Exxon or Chevron or Shell or what have you, and that's not being stated that you work on their behalf. That's a problem. Subsection 4. Engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. If they've got conflicts of interest, they're to disclose that if it could influence or appear to influence their judgment or the quality of their services. Notice the second clause there of the subsection. Not to get paid by more than one party for the same project at once, unless that's disclosed to everyone. Subsection C. You're not to be bribable. Engineers shall not solicit or accept financial or other valuable consideration directly or indirectly from outside agents in connection with the work for which they are responsible. So when you're working on a project, you're pretty much duty bound to that project. Subsection 5. Engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. So, for example, look at subsection A here. They shall not falsify their qualifications, permit misrepresentation of their or their associates' qualifications. So you're not to go out of your way to say, oh no, I'm skilled in this area when in fact you are not. Nor will you take it if you've been somehow misrepresented in some way. Oh, you've got a PhD in this. Actually, no, I don't. That's not correct. You ensure that everything is represented correctly. Further, they shall not misrepresent or exaggerate their responsibility in or for the subject matter of prior assignments. Oh yeah, I was in charge of building that thing when you weren't. So even if there are brochures, for example, for the company or other kinds of presentations that you bring to the table when looking at employment, you're not to misrepresent those either. Don't over-embellish your past assignments. Now notice this one, this last clause here, subsection B of section 5 in part 2. Engineers shall not offer, give, solicit, or receive, either directly or indirectly, any contribution to influence the award of a contract by public authority, or which may be reasonably construed by the public as having the effect or intent of influencing the awarding of a contract. Now, when does stuff like this come into play? Well, consider looking at driverless vehicles and the associated artificial intelligence there. Companies like Apple and Google and Tesla are up for those kinds of things. Do they get friendly with people in politics in order to acquire for themselves contracts? This says they're not supposed to do that. Further, they shall not offer any gift or any other valuable consideration in order to secure work. Like campaign contributions. They shall not pay a commission, percentage, or brokerage fee in order to secure work, except to a bona fide employee or bona fide established commercial or marketing agencies retained by them. Don't buy contracts. And to do so is out of accordance with the Code of Ethics. You'll notice in Section 2, the explication ends after the 5th canon of the fundamental canons of Section 1. So Section 3 is actually a really zoomed in expansion of that 6th fundamental canon. Let's take a look at some of the material in there. So Section 3, subsection 1, engineers shall be guided in all their relations by the highest standards of honesty and integrity. And that's something that actually goes back to the preamble. Honesty and integrity being the most important virtues for engineers. Again, while the Code of Conduct here has talked about competency in one's field, the virtues of honesty and integrity have been really ultimate in this Code of Conduct. Let's take a look at these subsections in here. A. Engineers shall acknowledge their errors and shall not distort or alter the facts. Remember, this is from 2007 here, but here we have a notion of 1, a willingness to admit when one is in error, and 2, not willing to distort the facts themselves. Not merely a willingness to not misinterpret the facts, but to not distort the facts in themselves. Subsection B, engineers shall advise their clients or employers when they believe a project will not be successful. Not in terms of it being lucrative, but it will not work. So you won't just take on a task because you're getting paid for it. If you, in your assessment as an engineer, believe that a project will not be successful, it cannot be done, you are to be honest and say so. Subsection C, outside work. Don't do it, or if you're doing it, be honest about it, because you can't give your full attention to the tasks you have at hand. Subsection D, engineers shall not attempt to attract an engineer from another employer by false or misleading pretenses, not merely trying to acquire others, especially through dishonest means. Subsection E, engineers shall not promote their own interests at the expense of the dignity and integrity of the profession. That is, an engineer is not supposed to do something that will denigrate or besmirch or do something dishonorable to the profession of engineering itself. In other words, don't do something that makes engineers look bad. It's still a professional obligation. Engineers shall treat all persons with dignity, respect, fairness, and without discrimination. Notice there, those aren't the exact ones enumerated by W.D. Ross. Those are unquestionably ongoing duties. Little deontology in there. Now, after the notions of honesty and integrity, we move on to the second subsection of Section 3. Engineers shall at all times strive to serve the public interest. So, honesty and integrity are number 1. After that, public interest is number 2. Now, there's some things in here that reiterate some kinds of the parameters that we've seen before. We've got, for example, in subsection B, don't do things that are dishonest when it comes to coming up with plans. But look at some of the other things in here. Subsection A, engineers are encouraged to participate in civic affairs. Get out there. Make a voice for engineering out in the world. Career guidance for youths. Work for the advancement of safety, health, and well-being of their own particular community. Subsection C, engineers are encouraged to extend public knowledge and appreciation of engineering and its achievements. Be a kind of apologist or ambassador or representative for engineering wherever you go, not just on career day. D, engineers are encouraged to adhere to the principles of sustainable development in order to protect the environment for future generations. Engineers, regardless of their competency, are to be custodians of the environment because of the knowledge that they have and because of the dignity and esteem of their profession. What we have here in subsection E is another form of ongoing duty in this. Engineers shall continue their professional development throughout their careers and should keep current their specialty fields by engaging in professional practice, participating in continuing education courses, reading in the technical literature, and attending professional meetings and seminar. You got your degree? Your education doesn't stop. An engineer has an ongoing duty to maintain their education so long as they're an engineer. And this is part of serving the public interest. Subsection 3 here goes back into avoiding deceit, and we've already talked about some of that before. Whereas subsection 4 goes into matters of integrity that we've also talked about before. Again, the preamble goes into honesty and integrity as the primary virtues of the engineer. Subsection 5 similarly says, engineers shall not be influenced in their professional duties by conflicting interests. One has to be aware of potential conflicting interests in order to come to terms with that. So there's a little bit of self-reflection involved in here as well. Engineers shall not attempt to obtain employment or advancement or professional engagements by untruthfully criticizing other engineers or by other improper or questionable methods. Don't be disingenuous about others merely because it's to your advantage. Again, echoing honesty and integrity. 7. Engineers shall not attempt to injure, maliciously or falsely, directly or indirectly, the professional reputation, prospects, practice, or employment of other engineers. Engineers who believe others are guilty of unethical or illegal practice shall present such information to the proper authority for action, whether that be to some kind of engineering authority or again to some kind of public authority, such as law enforcement. 8. Engineers shall accept personal responsibility for their professional activities, provided, however, that engineers may seek indemnification for services arising out of their practice for other than gross negligence, where the engineer's interests cannot otherwise be protected. You'll notice here the subsequent clauses. Engineers shall conform with state registration laws in the practice of engineering, and this one too, in terms of honesty and integrity again. Engineers shall not use association with a non-engineer, a corporation, or partnership as a cloak for unethical acts. Finally, subsection 9. Engineers shall give credit for engineering work to those to whom credit is due and will recognize the proprietary interests of others. Here, this is honesty and integrity when it comes to the notion of property. Someone's responsible for a design, you give them credit. You don't steal someone else's work. You ensure that all the proper copyrights and patents are in play and recognized. And you recognize that the property of employers is just that, the property of employers. So now, having looked at the 2007 Code of Conduct for Engineers, we can see there's elements of the various ethical theories that we studied earlier therein. There's virtue ethics and bits of deontology and bits of utilitarianism. You'll notice the relativistic theories don't really see much in there. You don't see too much about subjectivism or cultural relativism or divine command. Albeit we did see an invocation in the Creed from 1954 saying, basically something to the effect of, with God's help, we'll be able to accomplish this. But it seems like virtue ethics and deontology were the most prominent theories hiding in that code of conduct. Even the other universalistic theories. Not a lot of egoism in there. A little bit of utilitarianism in there. Not so much natural law, maybe a little bit of rights ethics in terms of the protection of property, with notions of honesty and integrity. That is, you have a duty or obligation not to divulge company property because they have a right to their own property. So things like copyright and patents, things like that. So what are the advantages of having these codes of conduct? Well, we'll say there's 8 things that your book describes that codes of conduct do that help orient an entire field. Now, this is true for really codes of conduct in any discipline. It could be business, it could be medicine, it could be philosophy. Here are the 8 for engineering. Here's what they do that makes them helpful. First of all, they serve and protect the public. It orients engineers to what their task is. If anything, there's a little bit of natural law in this aspect. It's the function of an engineer is to construct things that are beneficial to society. That's an engineer's task. Well, the code of conduct reminds them of that. Secondly, it gives them guidance as to all the obligations of engineers. So yeah, it orients you to remember you're here to serve the public, even if you don't work for the public per se. You're not employed by the government. You're not employed by the public. Your primary duty is to the public. And then you also have all these other elements of what an engineer is supposed to do in there. So it provides guidance. Furthermore, it provides inspiration. Guidance is different from inspiration. Guidance gives you a sense of what you ought to do. Inspiration gives you the motivation to do it. And that is, it expresses a collective commitment to the public good. Not just saying, oh yes, we're here to serve the public, but a commitment to it that motivates or propels one to do what they do. Another thing that a code of conduct does is it allows for shared standards. Again, going back to the origins of creeds, say in Christianity, when people said, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so on. The reason why they did things like that was so that there would be universal application. We can root out the heretics because we're all saying the same creed. So we're all believing the same stuff. And so we all have the same version. So that's why you have the same standards in various places. So at least with this code of conduct for engineers, everybody's got the same standards. We're all looking at the same material. We're all looking at the same core values. There's not like, oh, a code of conduct here, then a different code of conduct here, and this code of conduct here. Just one universal code of conduct that we can all use, at least in the United States. Also, this provides support for responsible professionals. So especially where one is seeking to act ethically, a code of conduct gives really a kind of moral spine. So if engineers need to do something like decertify an engineer who has done something unethical, this gives them the wherewithal to do that. By what authority do you have to defrock me of my engineering degrees or status? We can do that because the code of conduct gives us that authority. Also, it allows for education and mutual understanding. So we're talking about it right now. That's exactly its function, is to be able to be discussed, disseminated, and frankly pondered, especially with application to things going on in the real world. What does this mean for what happened in this incident? How ought we respond if we find ourselves in this particular kind of situation? It's exactly what it's for. So you have what some call an SOP in particular situations. That's a standard operating procedure. You know what to do. Oh, I'm very tempted by this unethical move that was made here. Someone offered me money to do X, Y, and Z to lie about this. Well, the code of conduct is very clear. Don't do that. That's what it's for. It's also for deterrence and discipline. Because of the measures that state unequivocally about notions of truth. Think how many times it mentioned honesty and integrity over and over and over again. If one is dishonest and disintegrated, that is, they don't have integrity. If those were the virtues that are the most esteemed, then those kinds of dishonest and disintegrating activities are the most abhorrent and require the most discipline and sanctioning. And that's part of the function of the code of conduct. Finally, codes of conduct are there to contribute to the professional's image. Notice this is not something that's private. This code of conduct is something that's accessible to everyone. You may not have known about it, but it's out there, and here's engineers saying, here's what we stand for, and this is what you can expect from us. And there should be the underlying assumption that if someone violates this trust, then it shall be remedied in accordance with appropriate justice. And that's because the reputation of a profession is essential in sustaining the trust of the public. If the profession is not continually upbuilt and affirmed, if it's not continually maintained, it will crumble and it will fall apart, and so will the public trust. So what are some of the potential shortcomings of codes of conduct? For example, despite their authority in professional conduct and guidance, they're not really the complete and final word because there's no court of appeals or Supreme Court that determines how the code of conduct is precisely to be interpreted. Also, there's a lot of stuff about obligations and responsibilities, but not a lot about rights of employers, of corporations, of engineers. Yes, there's some stuff on notions of property when it comes to the employer, but that's been some of the confusion when it comes to the code of conduct. Also, there may be perceived conflicts within the code of conduct itself. For example, there's all this stuff about honesty and integrity, but at the same time, there's content that talks about how the profession of engineering is to be held in high esteem and above reproach. So what happens when there's something that comes out that might make engineers and engineering look bad? Are you honest about it with the public, even though it might cause some kind of damage about how engineers are perceived? Or do you squelch that from becoming public, becoming dishonest in the process, but now at least nobody knows about it? And that's part of that intent versus consequence conflict that we discussed when we were talking about ethical theories originally. And I think we can say because the code of conduct goes out of its way to stress honesty and integrity so much, we can reasonably conclude that honesty should hold sway here. But nevertheless, we can see there is an implicit potential conflict between the responsibility of being honest versus the responsibility of making sure that engineering is seen as an esteemed profession of solid repute. You'll notice here that we've been talking about these codes of conduct. A lot of what has come up is the notion of responsibility. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at that very notion, the notion of responsibility.